The sale of strollers for puppies here in South Korea is soaring, and this reality was recently covered by the Wall Street Journal as the country continues to combat the world's lowest birth rate. We have details on this edition of Press Perspective. Hello and welcome to Tuesday's edition of Press Perspective. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we touch upon a social trend of relative concern here in South Korea is highlighted by an American newspaper with regard to the popularity of strollers for puppies amid an alarmingly dismal birth rate. For this, I have the writer of the article, Dasl Yoon, here in the studio. Dasl, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I also have Kelly Cho, editor for the Washington Post, with us as well. Kelly, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Right, Dasl, we'll start with you then. Let's begin with the gist of your article for the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, so we all know that South Korea is the country with the lowest birth rate. This story I did last month shows how there's been a trend in recent years of this massive popularity of dog strollers in Korea. And, you know, if we go to malls here or parks here, we see dog strollers everywhere. And according to Gmarket, which is one of South Korea's largest online retailers, since last year, they've sold more dog strollers than baby strollers. And same with dog food. They've sold more dog food than baby formula. So this sort of shows how much people care about their pets, but also how much people are willing to treat their dogs as babies rather than having actual babies in Korea.
Right, and this was a coverage that you made earlier in September, right?
Mm-hmm, yes.
And before we delve further into that report, how does this phenomenon, Kelly, of pampering pets here in South Korea compare to the reality in other countries like the US?
Well, in the US, we don't exactly have dog strollers everywhere, so there are some differences. But Americans really do love their pets. I read that about a quarter of South Koreans have a pet in their house. About 70% of American households have a pet. Pet products are a $147 billion industry in the US. That was the market size last year. I've heard stories about people going bankrupt, paying for their pet bills. I mean, they're certainly members of the family, and I think that's more and more becoming the case in South Korea. I do think that there are some cultural differences. In the US, pets are certainly part of the family, but in Korea, I think this is just my anecdotal experience, there's a little bit more anthropomorphizing of pets, dressing them up in clothes, pushing them in strollers, taking them to photo studios. Those things happen in the US, but not nearly as much. And another thing that I've noticed about Korea is that, you know, there's more community spaces where you can bring your pets. You can bring them to cafes, bars. I bring my dog to the grocery store and people don't seem to complain. And a lot of that is rooted in there's just less regulation here. And so it's kind of up to owners of businesses to create spaces for pets or not. Whereas in the US, there's a lot of red tape for these kind of things. But there's a lot of pampering happening in both countries, definitely.
Right. There are also holiday packages with your furry friends here in the country as well. Even Temple Stay I recently read.
I've looked at those.
Right. Right. Dasl, you compare the soaring sales of strollers for puppies to, like you mentioned earlier, the faltering ones for babies, as many in the country choose not to have children. Now, based on your coverage, why are women in Korea not willing to start families?
Mm-hmm. I think it's really hard for us to point to one reason and say this is why people are not having babies in Korea, right? It's a mix of a wide variety of reasons. A lot of people talk about sort of the hyper-competitive society here. They talk about the lack of time for childcare. They also say, you know, long working hours, housing costs. You can point to a lot of, you know, reasons as to why people are not having babies here. And I think there's definitely a shift in mindset for the younger generation that they want to, you know, focus on their lives more than giving up their lives or their careers in order to, you know, have a family. And so at the end of the day, I think it's whether people living in this country feel like it's a livable country for the future generation, and whether they want to bring life after them, and whether, you know, they want to prioritize that over other things that they prioritize already, such as their career or, you know, whatever it is that people care about more.
All right, and these thoughts that you just mentioned, Dasl, they also appear to be a universal trend. You said in your report that the reluctance to bear offspring is a global discourse. Kelly, I'm going to hand you this question. First, then, why does this phenomenon of being reluctant to bear offspring appear more prevalent, if I may, in wealthier countries like the US and South Korea?
Yeah, on one hand, this is a really hard question to answer because it's complex and there's a reason why so many countries haven't been able to fix it, despite their best efforts. At the same time, I think it's really simple. It's if you don't feel like you can take care of yourself, how are you going to take care of a child? And I think a lot of people, whether or not they can actually afford it, their perception of whether they can afford it is different. If you look at South Korea in particular, I don't have the answers, but one thing that I thought was interesting is there's something called the Global Happiness Index. It's put out by a market research firm. And the latest one showed that South Koreans were tied for the least satisfied in general, the least happy, with Hungary. And if you look at economic indicators, they were among the most unhappy with how their country's economy looks, and they were the most unhappy with among the most unhappy with their own financial situation. And they were the most unhappy when it came to the type of material possessions that they personally have. Now, this is just a survey. It's not something that we should take with, too much weight. But I do think it kind of indicates that, within South Korea, there's a lot of pressure to, have material goods to provide. And so I think there's a certain standard of living that people feel that they need to have for their children. And clearly they feel like they can't afford it. But this is also becoming the case in the US a little bit too. Families are happening later. The birth rates are going down, and the same in Europe as well. So I think it's just kind of this overall phenomenon of people feeling like or perceiving that they can't afford things, which this generation, the childbearing generation, certainly is more disadvantaged at large in a lot of these countries than their parents, their grandparents' generation.
Right. Dasl, for the sake of some perspective then, do share with us some of the alarming statistics with regard to Korea's birth rate and, of course, the prospects of its population some 50 years down the road, which I believe some pundits are saying our population of 51 million at present will be halved by then. How do these numbers for Korea also compare with those of its global partners?
So South Korea's birth rate right now, they're at a third of the level needed in order to maintain the population.
Which is 2.1 then?
Yes. And so that is quite alarming, and there is a reason why South Korean newspapers are always talking about, the country going extinct and how and when it will go extinct. And the projections are grim as well, because if we look at what government agencies are saying, they're saying that in the coming decades, South Korea's population could hit a point where it's as low as it was in the 1970s. In comparison, countries like the US, like Kelly mentioned, for example, yes, birth rates are falling there as well, and the US has seen historic lows in terms of, their birth rates. But at the same time, if we look at certain projections in the coming decade, it's actually seen that it will rise slightly more from what it is now. And that's, because of several different factors. For example, because, women who are giving childbirth, their age is going up, and there are lots of factors that contribute to that. But in terms of South Korea, the future seems bleak, and that is why a lot of government agencies have been, putting their heads together and trying to figure out how do we encourage people to have more babies here.
Right, and speaking of that, Kelly, the Yoon administration, it has been seeking to tackle the nation's dismal birth rate. Could you tell us a bit about the measures announced, and which initiative do you suppose looks to be more productive?
Well, honestly, I certainly can't advise on this issue. It's an ongoing problem. I've reported on it before years ago during the Moon administration, and we're seeing the same issues. And honestly, a lot of similar efforts. I think several of the last presidential administrations have been concerned about this. With Yoon, what I think is interesting is declaring this national population emergency, looking at potentially establishing a ministry or some kind of presidential cabinet or secretary position to deal with this. From what I've seen, there's a lot of talk about creating extended paternity leave, creating some kind of emergency leave for if your child gets sick for 2 weeks, things like that. And I guess what I wonder is whether or not people will actually use those benefits. One thing that I've observed about Korea is that, for instance, menstrual leave. women have a right to menstrual leave every month, but do they take it? A lot of them don't because they feel pressure at work that they can't. And I think we see that with maternity leave and certainly paternity leave as well. I think less than 7% of fathers in South Korea actually take paternity leave, and I know from my own family members who are Korean, they've often said to me, you know, I've had one kid, I can't have another, because they've already taken their time. And so there's a lot of unsaid, tacit pressure on people in South Korea to not actually use the benefits that are given to them. In the past, there's certainly been, you know, financial benefits given to parents, literally cash stipends, things like that, that deplete as the children age. And I think those are helpful. What I've heard from parents when I have reported on this is that it's nice, but it's not enough. It's not enough to make someone actually decide to have a child. But if you do have one, it's, you know, a nice touch. And so I think all these measures are good, but clearly this is a problem that's happening in a lot of very economically developed countries. And I honestly don't know what the solution is. And I think governments are also grappling with this question.
Right, they really are. And this is an impromptu question then. Dasl, what are your thoughts on efforts by the Yoon administration to deal with the dismal birth rate, such as extending paternity leave or offering more childcare services to mothers and fathers? What are your thoughts about on these initiatives?
I think a couple months back, we also did a story about how, you know, the Yoon administration has sort of increased these cash payouts to people too, basically saying, we will give you money if you have a baby, right? You know, if you have one child, we will support this. We will support your, you know, baby formula expenses or taking your kids to school, et cetera, et cetera. And none of it worked. I think even then, we saw a constant decline in the birth rate. In surveys, we saw people talking about how, no, this doesn't quite change our minds about whether or not we want to have babies. And I think the reason for that is because it's not necessarily about a shift in policy that's going to change people's minds. It's going to be about, you know, the social norms and about the culture and, you know, the workplace that they're in. A lot of different factors that will influence their thinking in terms of what I mentioned before, which is this a livable country for the future generation? And I think, you know, younger people are thinking more about that. Do I actually want a child to live in the same or similar environment that I have lived in?
Right, then staying with that, some people are indeed saying, like you and also Kelly mentioned earlier, that basically we need to have a shift in social norms about family structures, about working parents. There are some people suggesting that the idea of having children after marriage should also change. What are your thoughts on this?
So I recently saw this survey that asked South Koreans, what do you think is needed in order to balance your work life with your life at home? And a lot of people said we need time for childcare, and that ties into a lot of different things, which is you know, working hours, but also culturally, you know, societally, are they allowed to take the parental leave that is there as a policy? And Kelly mentioned this earlier, but it's a different story when the government says we're going to extend parental leave, and they say we want more men taking, you know, paternity leave, and them going to work and seeing that no one else is doing it, especially fathers, right? Or if they feel like there is, you know, this pressure that they may have to compromise their career if they do take the parental leave. I think that's why, you know, we have to think about how to change the social norms rather than constantly pushing for new policies, new cash payouts. Those are good. As mentioned before, those are good for people who are already willing to have babies and already have their mindset on having children. But for people who are like, no, I don't want children, I would rather, you know, pamper my dog, I think it's a whole different, you know, story.
Right, and Kelly, this is also an impromptu question based on what Dasl has said. Do you suppose introducing perhaps a 4-day work week system for the younger generation would perhaps encourage them to start families?
I mean, it might. I mean, I think this is a multi-pronged issue. If you look at the younger generations, like Gen Z people in the United States, for example, they are having less social connection, intimate relations than previous generations. So I think at the very basis of starting a family, there's finding a partner to start that family with, and then you have to worry about things like, do you have enough money? Do you have enough time to raise a child? Can you actually use the benefits that are available to you? I think work-life balance could have an effect. I'm not sure if it's the silver bullet to solve the issue, but I mean, just in terms of mental health and other things, it's certainly a good idea, and we see it in practice in parts of Europe and elsewhere, and who knows. But I do think that something like that would be quite radical for South Korea, and also the United States, to be honest, which is a country that's pretty obsessed with productivity.
And Kelly, if I were to ask you to perhaps highlight one country that Korea could look to as an example for some guidance with regard to encouraging couples to have children, which country would you care to highlight?
You know, that's a tough one. I did look. I think that this is such an issue around the world that it is kind of difficult to solve. As we mentioned earlier, the United States is seeing record lows for birth rates. Then again, the United States allows in a lot of immigrants, and that certainly helps. And I've seen some, white papers talking about how immigration might be one way to deal with this if you're really concerned about your population. In Europe, birth rates have fallen every year almost since 1960. If you look at the trend line, it's pretty down. But it varies a lot within European countries. For instance, France, I think, has a lot of social benefits, a very good social system, and so their birth rate might be higher than, say, Ukraine. So it's really hard to look at one country that has had this problem as acutely as South Korea and has fixed it, because I don't think such a country exists, quite frankly.
Right. And Dasl, in the meantime then, do dog stroller makers believe their sales will continue to remain high in the country?
Mm-hmm. So the dog stroller companies that I've spoken with, they say that the peak appears to be, over. Like it was really a couple years ago that they were selling the most dog strollers, because a lot of people were just seeing it around them and, willing to buy them. But I think there's an expectation that the market will continue to flourish, because South Koreans, they're one of the countries where the number of pets is rising, consistently, as opposed to countries like the US, where pretty much everyone already has a dog. I think in the US it's like 70% of people have dogs. In Korea, we're at about like 20-something% right now. So there's room for growth. And seeing the different types of things that are coming out for dogs. For example, I've seen omakase for dogs now. I've seen 5-star hotels offer bathrobes for dogs. I've also seen, or I've also heard our interviewees talk about how they spend hundreds of dollars on sweaters and supplements for their dogs. So there is a lot of room for growth in this market, even if it's not, necessarily more people are going to buy dog strollers.
And the stroller that you introduced in your article cost over $1,000, am I right?
Yes, there was one company where their strollers were quite expensive, and they were sort of targeting a niche group of people who wanted to show that they have luxury taste and that they're willing to spend, this much money on their pets. So their strollers were, going beyond $1,000. They had, they were using special cushions. They were going through special safety regulations that were set in Germany for baby strollers. So a lot of companies are going to extravagant means to kind of create luxury items for dogs in Korea.
With consumers who are willing to splurge then on their furry friends. Kelly, an article by the New York Times published this past weekend, I believe, also highlighted the growing companionship sought in pets by the elderly here in Korea. Now, this, of course, is a universal trend, right, given the health benefits of having pets for seniors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is actually something that I've thought about a lot in my personal life. I've seen how pets could help, my grandparents. I think, I've seen white papers that suggest that loneliness can actually be a higher danger or risk to your health than smoking or obesity. And certainly, I think we all might be able to relate to the fact that, when people are very old, in their 80s and beyond, just a small change in their routine can really kind of trigger a decline. And so I think pet ownership also keeps people to a certain schedule. It gives them a certain bar for physical activity. I've seen stories about, little robot seals being brought into nursing homes in Japan. I see that, dogs are volunteered into elderly care facilities in the US. And so it's certainly a benefit. And I would say, like, as someone in their 30s, you know, my dog gets me up in the morning and forces me to get some fresh air outside, and I think that's good for my mental and physical health. I probably get more steps in every week because of him, and so I can see how there's a lot of benefits for sure. There's also a really high cost to having pets, but there's a lot that it can bring to your life for sure.
Right, indeed, which is why dog strollers here are soaring in sales. All right, then I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this edition. Kelly, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts here. And Dasl, thank you very much for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.